Hello everyone, my name is Nick and today I'll be presenting on behalf of my group, Haley, Shubal, Kevin, and Mike. Today we'll be talking about Unit 6, which is about the not-for-profit sector and other affordable housing responses. So I'll just start out with a quick agenda. First we'll talk about the definition of affordable housing, and then we'll move on to talking about the main concepts for the week, including social housing and non-market housing. After that, we'll discuss some of the main points raised in this week's readings, which were creating market and non-market affordable housing by Curran and Wake, and building assets through housing by Mendelsohn. Finally, we'll wrap up by putting forward several questions for the class for this week's discussion. So what is affordable housing? Well, as we've seen in some of the previous modules, it is housing that does not cover over 30% of gross income for those whose income is between 60% and 120% of average mean income in a given locality. And this percentage of income spent on housing that will be deemed affordable may be higher if it is served by public transit and or is in a walkable neighborhood. One of the main responses to create affordable housing options is through social and non-market housing, which includes affordable rental and affordable home ownership. This category exists between market housing and temporary government subsidized housing on the affordable housing continuum and is designed for those who cannot access market rental or ownership and are not eligible for emergency shelters or transitional housing. The main forms of social and non-market housing include public housing, nonprofit housing, cooperative housing, co-housing, and non-market housing. We'll now move on to discussing these concepts in more detail. We'll start by talking about social housing. By definition, social housing is generally housing that is subsidized by the government, where rent is based on 30% of gross income. It consists of three main models. First is public housing, which is housing owned by the government. Next is nonprofit renting, which is housing that is subsidized by the government but is managed by a nonprofit housing corporation. Finally is cooperative housing, which is similar to non-market rental housing, but the units are owned and managed by the residents in a nonprofit structure, and the members must join by purchasing shares. The first form of social housing is public housing. At its basics, public housing are housing projects which are owned and rented from the government. These developments are segregated by income, wherein rent in all units is calculated according to household income. These are typically home to very low-income renters, as most people living in public housing have less than half the average income of renters, and as high as 96% of these households are in core housing need. Furthermore, over 60% are retired or unable to work, and another 60% had lived in public housing for more than 5 years, and 25% for more than 10 years. Some examples of this type of housing in Vancouver include Little Mountain, Stamps Landing, and McLean Gardens. Next is not-for-profit rentals, which are managed by not-for-profit housing companies and aim to meet social needs, not generate profit. Typically, these developments would not be viable without government funding, and not-for-profit rentals are usually restricted to people in dire housing need, but sometimes include an income mix between tenants. There are several main types of not-for-profit units. These include family-oriented rentals, which are designed to meet the needs of families with children, are mixed income and utilize well-designed open spaces. Mixed-use housing, which combines shops and housing and appeals to seniors and families. Heritage non-profit projects, which make use of renovated heritage buildings converted to several units for family housing. Nonprofit housing for seniors, which are often connected to community centers and include supporting housing services in the area for seniors. And nonprofit for a variety of residents, which mix seniors and families in the same development. The next step of the affordable housing continuum, non-market housing projects are developed outside of government programs. These are becoming more popular as governments continue to decrease funding for housing. Essentially, non-market housing works to fill the gap between those households who are not eligible for nonprofit housing and those that cannot access market rental or market ownership housing. This housing is often called non-market, near-market, or price-controlled housing and is characterized by long-term price restrictions, giving buyers access to housing at below market prices. By definition, non-market housing has three primary characteristics. First, it is privately owned. That means it's not operated or owned by an agent of the government. Second, it is socially oriented. That means the property's primary function is to meet the social needs of current and future occupants. And third, it is usually price restricted, meaning that prices are determined by a pre-existing formula, not by the market. And as a result, it should be perpetually affordable and housing is not treated as an investment. So now that we have a good idea of the main concepts, we'll move on to speaking about the main issues discussed by this week's readings. First, we'll talk about creating market and non-market affordable housing by Curran and Wake. This paper raises concern for the growing affordable housing crisis in British Columbia. Here, housing prices have been increasing for decades, going up over 30% in only the 2 years after 2008 alone. Vancouver is especially bad in this regard. In terms of percentage of income spent on home ownership costs, Vancouver is now far above the Canadian average at 70%. And the issue of unaffordability is now worse than at any point since the 1990s. In fact, a new RBC report even indicates that in the last quarter, the cost of a single detached home in Vancouver was 109% of median income. At the same time, funding for social housing, which was once provided by provincial and federal agencies, has since been cut and downloaded to the municipalities. So we now face a serious problem. The housing market nor government programs provide options for low and moderate income households. And here, Curran and Wake emphasize that local governments ought to take a leadership role in developing and implementing housing strategies. With this in mind, Curran and Wake introduced a toolkit focusing on the strategies local governments can use to supply non-market affordable housing. With this, they introduced the concept of smart growth, which advocates for the development of communities that are built around increased livability and vibrancy, well-designed, compact neighborhoods, mixed land use, and encouragement of growth in existing communities, increased transportation options, and the use of cheaper and greener infrastructure. Under this concept, they put forward 8 common options that local governments in BC can use to increase affordable housing. The first option presented is inclusionary zoning, which refers to zoning regulations that require an applicant to contribute to affordable housing as part of the rezoning for development. The main strengths of this approach are that it secures commitment to build affordable housing integrated across new projects in the community and is very straightforward. The main weaknesses are that it requires new development, it may result in segregation of market and affordable units, and the units are not always built. A good example is the City of Vancouver, which has been using inclusionary zoning since the 1980s, whereby 20% of units in a new neighborhood must be social housing. Next is secondary suites. These are any dwelling unit that occurs on a property in addition to the principal dwelling. These are now becoming more accepted as over 75% of Canadian municipalities now allow secondary suites. In terms of strengths, this is the most inexpensive way to increase stock of affordable rental housing. It is a mortgage helper to home buyers. It maintains neighborhood character, and affordable housing is integrated into neighborhoods. The main weaknesses are that it may increase the need for parking. They may be built far from the core of the community, and many may opt to have a secondary suite illegally instead of a registered one. The third option is a density bonus, which allows developers to opt into building to a higher density in return for providing amenities such as affordable housing. The strengths of this approach are that it delivers affordable housing at no additional cost to the developer, it promotes more efficient land use, and it works well in higher density neighborhoods. Unfortunately, this may not be sufficient to motivate developers to build affordable housing, can be controversial in low and medium density neighborhoods, and it may be difficult to manage due to the dispersal of units. A good example of this is the Burnaby Community Benefit Bonus Program, which was introduced in 1997 to increase amenities and affordable housing supply in 4 town centers, supporting density increases without compromising neighborhood character. The fourth alternative is the use of resale price restrictions, which limits the resale price of a home to below market value. In BC, this must be included as a stipulation on the title of the unit, and buyers must meet specific affordability criteria, usually following an income formula. The strengths of this method are that it keeps housing affordable for future generations and prevents market forces from pricing locals out of the market. However, owners cannot benefit from market value. It requires oversight and regulations, and it is not always popular with owners and developers. Here at SFU, we utilize price restrictions at the Verdant building in University, where resale units must be sold for 20% under market value. Option 5 is a housing fund. These are accounts that are set up by a municipality or regional authority to hold funds that are dedicated to the creation of affordable housing, usually from property taxes or cash in lieu. This is a good option because it involves nonprofit housing organizations with financial assistance. It creates a pool of funding for other projects and is relatively straightforward. Unfortunately, housing funds may require the constructing organization to provide the land. Possible segregation of affordable housing may occur, and often the amount of funding available is not enough for full project construction. Next is land banking, which is the acquisition of property for affordable housing by local governments or organizations. Its main strengths are that it provides sites for affordable housing and creates partnership opportunities between local governments and nonprofits. Its main weaknesses, on the other hand, are that low-cost or no-cost land for development is scarce. Local funds are very limited, and affordable housing zoning may be perceived as downzoning. A strong example of this is Bowen Island, which recently purchased 39 acres of surplus land from Metro Vancouver for a land bank to be used for affordable housing and civic facilities. The 7th proposed alternative is the formation of housing organizations, which are nonprofit entities that provide and manage non-market housing for qualified individuals and families. This is a good option because affordable housing is more likely to be built and properly managed by a group dedicated to that goal. As well, there is an identifiable community resource for housing, and there is an ongoing focus on affordable housing. However, these require outside funding, a self-sustaining business plan, and full-time organizations may be cost prohibitive. Whistler has been a leader in this area, having created the Whistler Valley Housing Society in 1983 to provide affordable housing for employees of the city. Lastly are partnerships for affordable housing. These are where for-profit and government agencies, or nonprofits, work together to provide an amenity for the community. In terms of strengths, these deliver affordable projects in the absence of senior government funding or participation. They can meet complementary goals and community needs, and they generate opportunities the market cannot deliver. On the other hand, partnerships can be time-consuming, they require a clear understanding of goals between partners, and they require a skilled nonprofit to manage the housing. Curran and Wake believe local government have the legislative authority to work with developers to use all 8 of the tools presented here, creating great gains in affordable housing within our communities. Now that we have seen potential solutions to the affordable housing issues, we will now examine Mendelssohn's take on whether renting or owning is a better way to accumulate personal assets. In financial terms, homeowners may find themselves sitting on substantial wealth, far beyond the amount they could have accumulated by saving a few dollars every month. It is this type of ideology that governments utilize when promoting homeownership. However, in addition to enabling low-income families to increase their net assets, other objectives could include creating better quality of housing for lower-income families, improving family functioning, pride, and social participation for low-income people, and creating viable, healthy, mixed income and mixed tenure communities. In reality, more savings may not always be better than more spending, as increased lifetime wealth is not always synonymous with increased lifetime well-being. To many low-income families, investing in home ownership is undeniably attractive. However, because housing prices constantly fluctuate, having a majority of one's funds tied up in a home may not be the best risk diversification strategy, especially when stable investments such as treasury bonds could be made while renting. That being said, the payoffs of home ownership can be enormous, relatively speaking, if the market appreciates. This is because it is very difficult for low-income families to make other investments that are so well leveraged. Mendelsohn examined what factors make purchasing a home a good investment compared to renting. Here, the primary alternatives that must be assessed are buying, using savings for a down payment, or renting and using the savings instead to invest. What must be determined is under what conditions will the value of the owner's equity in the home be more or less than the value of the investment and vice versa. With this, market timing is essential. If you buy in the peak and the price drops significantly, it's going to be a long time before you see a good financial choice. On the other hand, if the market is stable and prices are good, buying a house can generate serious financial gains very quickly. Mendelsohn looked at 12 different options to assist low-income homeownership. These include second mortgage with deferred repayment, shared equity with deferred repayment, shared equity with rental payments, shared equity with staircasing up to sole ownership, sale with right of first refusal at pre-established price, rent to own, forgivable grant to purchasers, forgivable grant to builders, repayable interest-free loan to purchasers, assisted savings plan, sweat equity and donated labor and materials, and land trusts. The results are summarized in the chart on the right. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to elaborate on each of these points, but if you're interested, there's an appendix at the end of this presentation which describes each option in more detail. The analysis of these options came to the conclusion that buying a house is not likely the best way for low-income households to acquire wealth, everything else equal. The housing market is very volatile, and ownership gives the effect of putting all of the eggs in one basket. Because of this leverage, when things go well, it's great, but it can result in huge losses when things go bad. This lack of diversification is an extreme risk for a low-income family. So which models are the most financially preferable for low-income households to generate stable wealth? Here, Mendelsohn concludes that models that decrease risk are clearly preferable for low-income households, even at the expense of losing out on some possible gains. In his analysis, the model that most increases risk, because it increases leveraging, is the second mortgage with deferred payment or repayment. If house prices depreciate or even fail to increase more rapidly than interest rates, the owner might quickly be in a negative equity situation. On the other hand, the model that most decreases risk is that of shared equity with deferred repayment. This model decreases risk because it lowers leveraging, so that the holder of the shared equity also bears some of the risk of house depreciation. So with all this in mind, we now have a much clearer picture of what social and non-market housing is, what steps can be taken to improve the affordability situation using these forms of housing, and how low-income people can invest in home ownership to best manage their limited wealth. It's now time for us to put this knowledge into practice. So that concludes our presentation for Unit 6. Thank you all very much for listening. We now invite you to post your answers to the discussion questions on the following slide. Kevin and Braden will be moderating the discussion this week, so please direct any questions or comments you may have to them. Thanks again.